is that you began dispensing of the idea that we should be objective. In fact, the idea is that we're supposed to take people's side. There was one famous essay written by a former president of the American Sociological Association in which he said, "Whose side are we on?" Well, Max Weber said, we're on the side of truth. We're not on anybody's side in that sense. As private citizens, we can be on all kinds of people's sides. But when we step into the sociologist chair to do research and analysis, we're not on anybody's side. Not so. See, we're going to take up the cause of the poor. We're going to take up the cause of the oppressed. And so suddenly you've blurred the line between scholarship and indoctrination and activism, and that became more and more common.
Okay, everyone, welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. My name is Anthony Costello. I'm the president of the Kirkwood Center. And today I'm joined by a good friend, David Ayers. David, is it Ayers or Ayers?
Ayers.
Ayers.
Okay. Yeah, we
Okay.
actually pronounce it wrong.
Yeah, okay, Ayers, like AJ Ayers, but
yeah.
We're not going to conflate David with AJ. Two very different types of scholars here.
Yeah, I would think so.
I don't think he's around anymore. I think he's been dead for a while. But so Ayers, a friend, but although we've never met in person, this is a virtual friendship, but a good one. David is a professor of sociology at Grove City College in Grove City, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, Grove City, Pennsylvania, not the
Grove
one in
City.
Ohio.
Pennsylvania. And so we're going to talk today a little bit about the intersection, and we hear a lot about the intersection between faith and science, especially in the apologetics world. And science usually means the natural sciences there. But we don't often talk about the intersection between faith and the social sciences. So we're going to have David on today to give us some insight into the discipline of sociology and how that interacts with the Christian faith. David, before we get started with some of the more substantive questions here on the topic, why don't you give us a little bit of a background? What got you interested in sociology, and just what you do at Grove City College, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the last part first. I'm professor of sociology here now. I was in different incarnations. I was the dean of the Calderwood School of Arts and Letters here for 5 years, and assistant dean for 10 years before that. At that time, that was about 2/3 of the school. We've reshuffled the school now. I was provost here for about a month and a half in an interim capacity. And then following that period, I just said I wanted to go back to teaching and writing and get back to what I really went into this in the first place to do. And so I've tried to be pretty active in publishing, speaking, writing, in a number of different venues. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. I've been a formal sociology faculty member for most of the years since 1986. King's College in New York when it was still in Briarcliff Manor, New York for 5 years, Dallas Baptist University for a couple of years, some work in consulting and private research, and then here since 1996. So I'm in my 27th year here at Grove City College.
Wow, great.
Yeah, so that's what that is. So you'd like to hear about how I got into sociology?
Yeah, I mean, so what motivated you to get into this field specifically then?
Well, it was sovereign accident, I guess we could say, in many ways. I was a psychology major, and my original goal in life was to be in some kind of clinical or counseling center in psychology, some kind of work in that sense. And that's what I got my undergraduate degree in. That's what I pursued. I'd come out of, I was a completely rebellious, screw up teenager, hippie, everything that goes with that lifestyle. like a lot of people, after I became a Christian and just settled into my faith after a few years, I wanted to be able to help people overcome the kind of things that that's fairly common. You dealt with a lot of issues in your life. You want to kind of begin helping other people with those issues. So that was my thought. And but towards the end of my time in informal psychology, I was really into the hardcore stuff, physiological, neuropharmacology, some of the kind of hard science sides of the disciplines. But I really became enamored and fell in love with social psychology, which is really more at the group interpersonal interaction level and the influence of the group on people.
Right.
So ultimately, when I picked I needed to pick a graduate school where my wife and I, who were just getting married, could live. And so I agreed to restrict my serious inquiries to the DC area, because that's where my family was from. And my wife's family don't live in any area where there's any universities, they're in a rural part of Pennsylvania. So it's fine, we're going to settle into DC. I'm going to see where I get accepted. I was accepted at American University in a master's program in psychology, to be mentored by a disciple of B.F. Skinner, a guy who did his training under Skinner at Harvard. And so it was like behaviorist social psychology. Okay. So that was 1982, and I was already accepted, and that was the plan. But for different reasons, I had to delay the start of my graduate work for a year. And during that year, became interested in a bunch of different things, but hopefully I won't make this too long, but basically through contacts that my wife has had as a result of a job that she got down on Capitol Hill with a large, with a company that did advertising and marketing for the Republican Party. I really became interested in the current kind of political and social policy and action stuff that was going on. And remember, this would be just during the middle of Reagan's first term.
Right.
And her company was ramping up to get him reelected. So we ended up then joining a church that a lot of people that she was connected with through her work were involved in, which included senatorial aides and one sitting congressman, and so a fairly small church. And through that, I just began to be really interested in, the social aspect of a lot of these problems. In other words, let's find out the social forces and the social dynamics that created these things that I'm trying to resolve, the kind of things by which I became a hippie, the forces that came into my life when I was 14, 15 years old and helped push me in these negative directions.
Yeah. Right.
And so, that was the milieu, and there was a lot of opportunities it's there that I really became more formally conservative. So it's kind of surprising that I ended up in sociology. But during that year period where I kind of put the graduate school thing on pause, but was still formally accepted at American University, I said, well, I wonder who does this even more. And I found out that the sociology department at American University had a robust program in social psychology, and that the people in it had really impeccable training, University of Chicago, stuff like that. I had never taken a sociology course in my life, not one. We wouldn't call it social psychology and sociology now, we would call it micro-sociology. But they then would use and work with a lot of the psychological social psychology, so there was an overlap between them. So the person who was probably the leader in that program, I met with her for a pretty good period of time, and we talked it through. And at the end, when I went home and had a chance to talk and pray to my wife about it, I decided to switch to the sociology department. So I didn't even have to get accepted into it. But I went into my first courses in graduate school in sociology without ever taking a single sociology course. It was thrown right into the middle of the fire with all these kind of European sociological theories and Montesquieu and Thomas Hobbes and Max Weber and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And of course, in graduate school, they're throwing you right into the primary reading. So it worked. I ended up, doing well in the program, got a full scholarship and everything. And so, the bottom line is that then I finished my master's degree in sociology. And then my idea was that I really wanted to use my knowledge and my research skills in kind of the social research setting. In a lot of those jobs that exist in and around places like Washington, D.C., where you're studying all these different social issues and producing, white papers and conference speeches,
right,
policy recommendations, for Heritage Family, Child and Family Protection Institute, National Right to Life, Family
right.
Research Council was just getting started at that time. So at that time, I had absolutely no intention or even thought about becoming a college professor. And I wasn't really sure if I wanted to continue on to graduate school in sociology, or if I really needed to, now that I was rather than just kind of working in the field as an applied researcher.
Right.
But I met a guy who was a professor at Grove City College at a conference. And he said, conservative sociologists are rare as hen's teeth. If you're willing to pursue a PhD, we have an opening at Grove City College. We'd like you to apply for it. And I'd never thought about it before in my life. So I did. They turned me down. But then they offered the job to another guy who turned them, and he was a conservative sociologist. He turned them down because he wanted to stay in the New York City area.
Mm-hmm.
But then his other sociologist quit. So he contacted Grove City College and said, did you guys get to interview any conservative sociologists, because we really need one? And they said, well, there's a guy we turned down because he doesn't have his PhD, Dave Ayers, maybe you should interview him. He did, and I was hired. And
right.
so, and then the requirement that went with that is I had to pursue a graduate degree in sociology. New York is a great place to do that. Much, much better kind of choices. And so I ended up doing and pursuing a PhD in sociology at New York University.
Okay. Yeah.
As people like to say, the rest is history. I was kind of hooked. And I really fell in love with the academic life and teaching. And so I became kind of confirmed as both a college faculty and as a sociologist, really in my time in New York. Interestingly, then I was still on Grove City College's radar. So later on, 10 years later, when they were looking for a conservative sociologist again, because the one that they eventually hired had been promoted to dean, right? He went through his files and got some recommendations and said, who's this Dave? So then it was the same kind of thing. He interviewed me. I replaced him as he moved into a dean role. And then I eventually became the dean.
Right.
So it's kind of funny when we talk about backgrounds in areas, we oftentimes fail to. And I'm a Calvinist, so I hate using this word. Happenstance, luck,
fortuitousness. Right.
Remember, John Lennon said that life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans.
Right.
I should write a book. I'm the accidental sociologist.
The accidental sociologist. That's a great title.
Well, because the other thing is, because I'd had no prior exposure to the discipline, I didn't know how liberal most of them were. And so
right. Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit.
And if I had known that, I would have probably never agreed to do it. But because I was ignorant, and then I ended up kind of falling in love with the kind of higher end of the discipline, the great thinkers, the great kind of theorists, and
like Weber,
like Max Weber, right?
Yeah, Weber's oh my goodness. I mean, every book I read in theology, philosophy, contemporary philosophy, I mean, there's always some reference, at least one reference to Weber. He's just had his fingerprint in so many different areas, right?
Law, economics, history.
Yeah.
He helped write the Weimar Constitution. Just an amazing.
I mean, I'm writing a book on booklet for another ministry called Ratio Christi right now on paganism, and get Weber quotes everywhere, right? Because he wrote, his theories on magic and ritual and cult. I mean, it's just the guy.
Social Psychology of the World Religions is a masterpiece, and it still works. Plus, he wrote extensive book. A Weber book is 800 pages of fine print and columns. On every major world religion. that was just in his spare time when he wasn't writing Economy and Society.
Yeah, these guys, their mental capacities were were astounding. Probably they didn't have the internet either, so they could they had better powers of concentration.
True. I think you're right about that.
Well, I mean, the great story. I mean, I'm thinking of this time period in your life when you're in DC at the height of the Reagan administration, studying psychology and then sociology. I mean, all the kinds of inputs that you must have been getting, that must have been just a very rich time in your life for thinking, developing your own thoughts about things, and then also studying, sociology as you see it, as you're seeing it kind of being utilized and put into play, right, in the political world, which I don't know, maybe we'll get into this, but in a sense seems to me where a lot of sociology sort of makes itself known today is in the in the realm of politics, right? Is in
politics and culture,
yeah. So and also I appreciate your personal story of being when you were a teenager. For me, it wasn't the hippie era; it was the era of grunge. But they weren't in. I think it was. I've actually thought about this, and I've meant to write something about this. I think grunge was worse because there was at least a sort of hopefulness, I think, in the 60s and maybe early 70s that went along with even the sexual revolution, that there could be some kind of coming into, the new age of Aquarius or whatever. But that by the time you get to grunge, I think you're just at the aftermath of that. And by the time you get to the 90s, it's an embrace of the nihilism that actually led to. And and you get movies like Reality Bites and stuff where it's just, there's no more hope left in that hopeful attitude, hopeful revolutionary, sort of impulse.
Yeah, grunge people are not going to be walking up and down rows of National Guardsmen holding rifle and putting a daisy down.
No, they won't even go to the activity. They're not even going to show up, right, at the end of the day.
No, that's true. Yeah, it's different. Although we were very good at self-destruction, and I will say that I was extremely self-destructive. And in that sense, then it made sense that I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
And that
it's part of the redemption, the redemptive.
I still do, but rather than sitting down with them individually and trying to help them cope, I'm more wanting to address the social forces that lead to the problems in the first place.
So let's jump. Actually, it's not quite the first question, the second question I had in mind, but let's talk about this issue that you brought up of the relative scarcity of conservative sociologists. And I read one here. I think I don't know if you're familiar with Carl Zimmerman, the Harvard sociologist from the 40s.
Oh yeah. Back in the 40s, you had them.
Yeah, back in the 40s, you might have still had some. But and he mentions the Chicago school here and there in this book, Family and Civilization. But okay, let's jump to that since it came up in your story here. What about this discrepancy in sociology being, and I have a personal story about this. I had one sociology class in college as a freshman at Notre Dame. And maybe this will put some, it's kind of an example of what I would call the very liberal sociology that I got, even at, maybe Notre Dame was still somewhat conservative in the 90s.
It's better than most, yeah.
Yeah, it's better than other Catholic schools, for sure, although the battle rages, to be sure. And I had a sociology professor, I'll never forget his name. His name was Lincoln Johnson. And I remember in that class, you're a 17-year-old kid, you're not thinking very critically, and certainly you're kind of accepting whatever comes out of the professor's mouth as almost like sacred writ, because you're not going to challenge the professor in class, and you probably don't even have the chops to do it. And I remember him telling us about how sociologists had sort of discovered that we needed something better than the golden rule. The golden rule was a decent moral standard for its times, but what we needed was an upgraded moral ethic, which he called the platinum rule. And the platinum rule went something like, it wasn't do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It was do unto others as as they would want you to do unto them. So it added in the kind of this postmodern sort of twist of, and of course, as a 17-year-old undergrad, you don't kind of think of jumping up and saying, but Dr. Johnson, does that mean if somebody asks me to saw off their right arm because they want to, I should do it?
Here's where it's gone, of course.
Yeah, but it does seem that there's a great discrepancy between liberals doing sociology, or leftists even, as opposed to conservatives. So maybe expound on that a little bit for us.
Well, first of all, the roots of sociology really are in the 19th century and kind of flow out of this post-Enlightenment period, right? Where on the one hand, religion is no longer going to kind of dictate laws and morals, and you're not going to go to religious leaders for your advice and precepts as to how to rule and govern society, right? At the same time, you've decided that this idea of total revolution and totally remaking society from the ground up, has been tried in France and it didn't work out real well. So, and now religious thinkers are coming forward, the Catholic post-Enlightenment people and everything. And they're talking about a different way of looking at society. So you're kind of absorbing that in, right? So your impulse is going to be more reformist, but you're still going to have a kind of a problem focus. You're also then going to be increasingly employed by governments and other large-scale entities to learn about and develop kind of, quote, scientific solutions to problems. Now, this idea of wiping the slate clean and starting all over again, like Robespierre wanted to do, and like people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and so forth. No, that's a bad idea.
So but those early kind of philosophical and revolutionary attempts, where you're gonna start the calendar over in the age of reason, and that were more sort of also connected to the Enlightenment period, right? Come the 19th century, there's a realization that kind of program is not gonna, it doesn't work, right?
There's one group of people and one major thinker who still thinks that the Enlightenment just didn't go far enough. His name was Karl Marx, and he becomes the true inheritor of the Enlightenment impulse. He viewed it that way too. He thought of it that way. But it's interesting that Karl Marx had very little influence in sociology, almost into the mid 20th century. It was very much a kind of a fringe idea. If you look at really old sociological theory textbooks for undergraduates and graduate students, Marx is barely mentioned.
Okay.
So it's reformist, right? Now, if it's reformist, you're using government data, you're serving government in many capacities, then that's going to tend to bend towards people that at least move in a little bit more of a socialist direction. Not communist, but you know what I mean. In other words, more of a kind of an active hand of governments and large corporations in terms of modifying,
managing, organizing,
managing, organizing, and so forth. So
yeah.
There's already that kind of a bent. But the other thing you have fairly early on, and a lot of these people were not Christians. Some were, but most weren't.
Who were some of the? I mean, in this vein, who are we thinking about as the kind of the founding fathers in this movement of sociology?
In France, Emile Durkheim, who was an agnostic Jew, came from a long line of rabbis, very much a corporatist and engineer. Max Weber, who always was very ambivalent about religion. His mother was quite devout, genius. Georges Simmel, also a Jewish guy, much more in what we would now call the micro-sociology, interpersonal type of analysis. these are some of the kind of major thinkers. You have some of the the British thinkers like Sumner and so forth. So that's the and again, Marx is a French character who didn't even bother with or think about what ultimately became sociology. So first of all, right off the bat, you have a field that's going to be kind of disproportionately attractive to people that kind of are certainly more in the center to center left kind of a realm. Now,
Because
once
they
you
are
get
looking for a different sort of source of authority.
right, they definitely are. They're looking for a secular and scientific source of authority.
Yeah.
But what's also governing them, and Max Weber is the person who really created the definitive statements on this right at the very outset of the discipline. They believed in something called value-free sociology, which meant you have your personal values as a citizen and as a human being. You're going to act on the basis of those values and beliefs. Those values and beliefs are going to shape the kind of things that you're interested in. But once you sit down to study them, the thing that matters is what's true and what's not true, and you're to pursue that irrespective of your values and ideological judgments. And you're going to basically employ methods and checks and balances to safeguard that process, to make sure that basically when you sit down to actually tackle a social issue, that you're going to do it, you're going to set your values to one side and just look at the facts, right?
Which is also the case in psychology as well, right? Yes. That the therapist sets aside any evaluative sort of judgment over the patient, right?
That's right. And so for example, if I was doing research and I wanted to see whether sexual orientation was associated with happiness, and my research actually showed that homosexuals are happier, irrespective of my Christian beliefs, I would be morally required to report that. Now, as a Christian, I can get there by means other than Weber. I can say we're supposed to tell the truth and let God settle it. So what ended up happening, I think two things happened, particularly starting in the middle of the 20th century in sociology. One was the influx of Marxian thinking, both direct kind of orthodox economic Marxism, and increasingly the influence and power of communist countries exerting themselves and creating whole academic schools in which Marxism was the orthodoxy. So if you were a sociologist in the Soviet Union, I believe that Raisa Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev's wife, was actually a Soviet sociologist. They're giving you Marxism as your theory, period. I mean, that's it. I had a Marxist professor of sociology who learned Marxism in a Soviet prison camp after he was captured as a member of the German military on the Eastern Front. The funny thing is, he was actually kind of conservative. He thought communists were nuts, but Marx was right. In other words, let's use this analytically, but let's forget this.
Boy, that's funny because we hear that a lot, right? I mean, that refrain of, well, Marx was right. It's just that everybody who's tried to implement him has somehow been horribly wrong.
Right. And in his case, he believed, don't try to implement it. What we need is a free democracy.
Yeah.
But class analysis works in explaining a lot of social phenomena. Anyway, so you had that. But the other thing is that you began dispensing of the idea that we should be objective. In fact, the idea is that we're supposed to take people's side. There was one famous essay written by a former president of the American Sociological Association in which he said, whose side are we on? Well, Max Weber said, we're on the side of truth. We're not on anybody's side in that sense. As private citizens, we can be on all kinds of people's sides. But when we step into the sociologist chair to do research and analysis, we're not on anybody's side. Not so. See, we're going to take up the cause of the poor. We're going to take up the cause of the oppressed. And so suddenly you've blurred the line between scholarship and indoctrination and activism, and that became more and more common. So
it's sort of like a moralized project now. It's a moralizing project instead of
that's right. so for a lot of sociologists, one that's now deceased, who I actually had the opportunity to get to know at Rutgers, Irving Lewis Horowitz, who was privately very liberal, kind of a more tilted on the left side, right? But to him, he felt that his political ideology didn't matter because he believed in value-free sociology. So he actually contacted me as a conservative and encouraged me in the discipline, and was actually trying to help me get some stuff published. He said, Dave, we need more people like you because there are very few young sociologists who want to do value-free sociology. You know, in other words, it didn't matter to him whether I was a conservative or a liberal. He wasn't interested in my political orientation. He was interested in my skills, my research chops, and my ability to be restrained and disciplined in the way that I did my research. But he described it as a kind of a lost art. And
this is happening. This shift is happening in the 40s and 50s, roughly. It's going from this more objective, value-free, Weberian kind of sociology to a more value-oriented.
And it takes off like a rocket in the 1960s.
Activism, yeah.
And it takes off like a rocket in the 1960s as people start going into the discipline in order to change the world along a left-wing line. You know, the student activists suddenly find that sociology is a great program to join, right? Because you can learn these skills and these knowledge in order to change the world. But they're not interested in objectively understanding it. They're coming in as activists, and oftentimes they're learning sociology from professors who don't want that at all, right? That's not really where they're at. So what that's going to do then is it's going to marginalize the conservatives in the field, and it's going to discourage conservatives from joining the field. So the Carl Zimmermans, I don't know if you'd call him a conservative or not, but Philip Rieff. I mean, who uses Philip Rieff's ideas about the therapeutic self the most, right? Conservative, liberal.
Carl Truman.
Well, that's right.
Your colleague.
Rodney Stark has been one of the great defenders of Christianity and its influence in Western civilization, just a giant. Robert Nisbet, just phenomenal. Talcott Parsons, at one time the most preeminent sociologist in the country, conservative. Patirim
Sorokin. Yeah. Zimmerman mentions Sorokin. Yeah.
Yeah, conservative, right? So these people eventually gets marginalized and they become read less and less. So for example, there's still a Sorokin Prize in sociology. I wouldn't be surprised if half the people that get the prize don't even know who the guy is. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but they've probably never read him. I doubt there are many sociological theory classes in the country where Sorokin is still studied seriously. In graduate school, I did not study Sorokin seriously. I studied him seriously on my own. So you can see what's happening there, right? The field is becoming more activist. Marxism, including the cultural and Frankfurt School critical theory stuff, is beginning to flood in, particularly through Europe and through New York City, through the New School for Social Research and the base that they established there during and immediately following World War II. So you basically have culture, just to be very generic, economic and cultural Marxism beginning to push into the field.
Right.
A lot of 60s radicals are very attracted to all that. Herbert Marcuse is like a guru to these guys, right?
Yeah.
They go to sociology, they bring all that baggage in them, and they dump the idea of value-free sociology. And so increasingly, there's a lot of good people in the discipline, and that includes some liberals that I read. I think of a family scholar who's a liberal. I think he's at University of, I'd make a mistake here, but his name is Nicholas Wolfinger. There's Brad Wilcox. He's a conservative family sociologist, Roman Catholic, right? We have Nicholas Wolfinger, who interacts with him a lot and writes for Wilcox's Institute. He's a liberal.
Yeah.
They interact comfortably. They agree to disagree about a lot of things, but they reconcile their differences based on data and logic.
Right.
It's still out there, but they're seriously outnumbered.
Well, and then I want to get into, because as you know, I've done a lot of research on the Frankfurt School. Actually finished this monster.
Yeah.
just not too long ago, Wiggershauss's biography of the Frankfurt School. But this conversation, like you mentioned, Wilcox, and what was the other more liberal?
Nicholas Wolfinger.
Wolfinger, like that kind of conversation where you got two people who have maybe different political and religious leanings, but they're having this sort of, reasonable, cordial, back and forth conversation academically. And we kind of see this mirrored in the popular culture, where you get these Christians and certain atheists or agnostics who are still operating in that way, right? They're having
Robert George and Cornell West.
Douglas Murray and somebody else, or now this Peter Boghossian and our friend and colleague Corey Miller, who have gone back and forth. And Dennis Prager usually, he kind of categorize. He tries to make this sort of idea that there's the left and then there's the liberals, and we're in conversation with liberals. These are classical liberals who still hold to certain kinds of, values or, that aren't just all out activists. But then there's this radical element in the culture that is the left that you can't even have a conversation with them. And I had a few months ago, Owen Anderson at Arizona State University. We talked about this because there was a massive uproar because him and some colleagues invited Dennis Prager and a few other speakers to come to ASU. And of course, the non-value free,
the anti-fascist,
the anti-value free contingency on campus, the DIE activists, not DI, the DI activists, just started using all of the political rhetoric that they could, to shut the thing down, shame the participants and the organizers and so on and so forth. So let's talk about then this activist component that sort of seeps in the, this more explicitly Marxist component in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And specifically, let's touch on the Frankfurt School, because as far as I can tell, they're at least one major source of this influx of, especially with Marcuse. Adorno's more, nobody can understand him anyways, but it seems to be like Marcuse, he's called the guru of the new left, the father of the sexual revolution. So help us place Frankfurt School thinkers and their philosophy of society kind of into the mix here, if you can.
Well, they're going to, what if I was going to summarize the Frankfurt School, and I'm not going to, analyze myself as an expert on them, although,
right,
especially in my master's program, we got a pretty good dose of it. Now there's the better people, and they've kind of broken away, and they're thinking like Jürgen Habermas.
Yes.
It's still
well,
really
and let me, we should say that the term critical theory is born in the Frankfurt School. I mean, that term really applies to their work. And I'll say, for the sake of the audience here, the Frankfurt School, we could say, basically started in the 1920s in Frankfurt am Main. And it's 3 or 4 main thinkers are Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, maybe Eric Fromm at the beginning, although he falls away a little bit later. And then you got a few other guys like Friedrich Pollock and Neumann and so, who are sort of literary theorists and economists. But the 3 guys that we're really thinking of who coined the term critical theory, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse. So just for the sake of the audience here.
Yeah, so what you're going to really see with them is that they're going to continue this transformative revolutionary vision of Marxism, and they're going to be using kind of Marxist categories in some ways, for example, dialectical reasoning and this kind of thing. But they're going to be viewing that liberation and freedom really more in the personal thing. And unfortunately, of course, part of this is sexual freedom.
Yeah.
And the idea that having sex with anybody, anyway, anytime, human, animal, object, you know, the idea that, in other words, it became liberation from moral strictures, the idea of authentic is, you know, being authentic and all these, and then looking at these oppressive kinds of things that hold people down and keep them from full liberation, autonomy. Marx talked in similar terms, but he viewed the key to that as ultimately economics, right? The elimination of private property, equalization of property, collective ownership of property. And so he still wanted sexual liberalism and all this other kind of stuff. But the other thing is, for the critical theorist, culture becomes much more important than economics.
Mm-hmm.
And so the action is not going to be so much in you know, for example, being active in labor unions and trying to do worker takeovers of corporations or establish worker political parties and things like that. It's going to have to do with identity. It's going to have to do with culture. There's going to be a huge emphasis about uncovering the hidden oppression in things like education, media, a lot of critical theory books written about advertising and the manipulation that capitalists manipulating us through, manipulating our wants and desires, consumerism. They're going to pay a lot of attention to art, literature, all this kind of stuff. And so it's really a very transformative thing. The other thing that they share is that they may have, some of them had a short love affair with Maoism, you know, with Chinese style communism, maybe. But they mostly hated Soviet communism, and they viewed it as just, you know, a different kind of oppressive structure. Marcuse detested Soviet communism. You know, a lot of them really did. And in return, the Soviet communism viewed them as heretics, because Marxism is really a religion, right? So,
Yes.
so they're like the equivalent of Shiites to the Sunnis in Moscow.
Right.
You know, if you were going to use that kind of framework, that what the heck are you guys doing talking about culture? But then they're also going to be creatively absorbing certain aspects of Max Weber.
Sure.
They're drawing on people like Antonio Gramsci and his cultural Marxism and his Marxist project.
Georg Lukács also.
Yeah, Lukács. So you have it ends up being remarkably amenable to the American scheme. And so the action is going to shift from focusing on workers and labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
To identity transformation and taking over the cultural apparatus. And I would say that, stepping back from sociology as a whole to looking at where we're at right now as a nation, that project has been much more successful.
Yes.
I mean, who thinks of the Democratic Party as the worker party anymore? Most workers are much more sympathetic to Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan than they're ever going to be to Joe Biden. But Joe Biden is talking about 3-year-olds doing gender transitions.
Yeah, it's the party of sexual liberation, not economic liberation.
Right, and all kinds of other forms of identity, so that rather than looking for a press secretary who's got AFL-CIO chops and a long history of advocacy for labor, right, which would have been more like Jimmy Carter, or Harry Truman or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, although he had a lot of communists too. But instead, you know, Biden's looking for a press secretary who's an African-American lesbian, right?
Right. That
ticks the right boxes for him. He does something similar with the Secretary of Transportation. So we've seen this in other areas as well, and so
where is as an academic discipline then? Where are most? I mean, I don't know if you can get numbers of it. This sort of cultural Marxist form of a way of doing sociology that certainly seems to have had the greater impact. I mean, but amongst professional sociologists in the academy, do they just outnumber even the more the value free sociologist who's just working in the Weberian sense? I mean, is it just can you quantify that in any way, or give us an estimate?
Well, they definitely outnumber them.
Yeah.
And if you go online and you look at the American Sociological Association, and you just look at their platforms and statements and so forth,
Yeah.
it's really clear that there's been a dramatic shift in the discipline. Now, at the micro level, there are still departments and places where conservatives can thrive, and the more kind of center or liberal kind of scholars in those areas, the bulk of them buy into the idea that ultimately there's a student here who needs to learn, and you need to teach them, and their ideology, their religious beliefs is really none of your business.
Mhm.
What's important here is theory, facts, logic. They're out there, and I would say, for example, I had a good experience at New York University. I had a good experience at American University, but we did have a couple people in the department who were aggressively left in a way that led them to persecute and treat very unfairly people that they believe were not were not, quote, with the program.
With the program. Right.
Yeah, and I think you're getting more than that. So you have it's become, I think, if I had to characterize the discipline as a whole, I would say hostile. So I'm not going to give you the name, but I know a person is a conservative sociologist of unbelievable productivity and reputation, turned down for tenure. And the thing was so bald and political. Mm-hmm. Now, meanwhile, people are getting tenure who are flakes with absolutely, crappy records of scholarship, right?
Yeah.
To the point where the state, because thankfully this person was at a public school, so the state government, and I won't say who the actors were, stepped in and had to get the president to overturn the decision of the department. So the person was ultimately granted tenure by the administration under political pressure, and not by the sociology department itself. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of stories. Mark Regnerus is a conservative Catholic scholar at University of Texas, Austin, top 10 school, phenomenal scholar. I'm grateful to him. He recommended one of my books, and we've interacted on and off, electronically. He's a really great guy. But he was put up on charges because he did research that showed that gay parenting didn't work as well, using a fairly large sample size. And it went through a blind referee process in a major journal. You see what I'm saying? In other words,
yeah,
he could not have possibly. And yet suddenly, well, he ultimately ended up being exonerated, but the message is really clear.
James, what was his name? I mean,
Mark Regnerus.
Regnerus. I've read.
Look him up online. You'll see.
Yeah, I just I didn't realize his name was pronounced like I was thinking Regnerus, and because
might be.
Okay. I know who you are. I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
And would he still be employed there if he would he be hired there now? And would he be employed there still if he hadn't had tenure when this whole thing kicked in?
Right.
James Coleman, major sociological thinker, now deceased, conservative rational choice theorist, was attacked viciously because he found out that busing didn't improve anybody's education. Did rigorous study. Another one was he became a Democratic senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Harvard sociologist.
Right.
He's the guy who basically found out that illegitimacy rates were skyrocketing in the African American community and wiping out all the 60s gains. In other words, we were fighting a losing war against poverty because of out of wedlock pregnancy. And
he wrote them during the Johnson administration, right? Was it for Johnson that he produced that report?
And the fact that had a chilling effect on sociologists doing serious scholarship on politically divisive issues. It's actually called the Moynihan effect. In other words, what Regnerus experienced at University of Texas Austin and what Coleman experienced was the Moynihan effect.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't. I actually had a
So
guy tell me
basically, when the data you produce doesn't match up with the theory, right?
with the left wing
With
ideology.
with the ideology,
Right.
then you got to suppress the data and the person who found it, or who put it together.
Yeah, and there are plenty of exceptions to that. So you almost always end up making, it's hard to talk about it without making things seem worse than it is. But I would have a real hesitation, and I know people who are going into it who are really fine, but I would have a real, if a top drawer student came to me and said, I'm going to pursue a PhD in sociology, I would want to really sit down and talk to them about whether it's a good idea and where.
Yeah.
Notre Dame, by the way, would be one of the places where I would be. Texas Austin, University of Virginia, Princeton. In other words, there's certain places where I would say if you go there, you'll be treated fairly, and you'll be dealing with some at least some like-minded people. But for a lot of places, I would say you're dead on arrival. Don't bother. And even then, once you've got your PhD in hand, if you're doing research on things that matter and you care about, and you're beginning to develop an intellectual track record, good luck finding a job.
It's
as
funny.
an academic.
And you say about not wanting to make things sound worse than they might be, but what you just said with regards to whether if you had a young person come up to you and ask you about a career or path in sociology, I say the same thing to young men who come up to me and ask about the military. I say almost, I was like, it's very difficult for me right now, and because of what has come even into our military ranks through this Marxicized sociology that we've been living with now.
Yeah, DEI.
Men come to me who I think otherwise would be great soldiers, great servicemen, maybe women. And I'm like, boy, when I was getting out, it was already the ethic, the ethos was not right. You could tell it was not quite right anymore. And I can only imagine from what I hear from people who have gotten out more recently that it's only gotten worse. So when a young man comes to me who's an athlete, and I say who's got the right kind of mindset, who's disciplined, who's got respect, I'm just like, I don't know if I can really recommend to you the military. I mean, certainly not the Navy, the Air Force, maybe the Marines, you still can shoot for, but it's hard to say these days whether or not I'd make that recommendation.
My son went into the Marines. He's a Marine Reserve MP, does his duty out of Billings.
Yeah.
And he's a law enforcement officer in Wyoming. But he looked at that going in, and he decided he wanted to be in the branch that still had, he called it a warrior ethos.
Yeah.
And the least affected probably of the major branches, right?
Yeah. Or you get in the Army and you can get into some special operations units or things like that, maybe where it's a little bit more right. You have a more traditional ethos. But yeah, I mean, the regular Army, even right now, from what I've heard, very difficult to recommend that for a young person.
And I had a student, and I talked to a student just within the last few days who was rethinking his plans to join. Yeah. Because he watched what happened in the Pentagon and the DEI initiatives and practically shutting everything down to retrain everybody. And he just said, I really don't want to have to deal with that. So he's only now considering it if he can get into some kind of a special forces operation or potentially the Marines. But
now there is a question there, and that emerges, I think, whether it's, whatever area of occupation or vocation might be, is, do you still go in there?
That's right.
Thinking or hoping that, well, this has to be reformed somehow. And if you don't go into it and try and reform from within, then it almost seems it's almost hopeless then.
And that's the kind of, just as you've kind of experienced with the military, is you want good people to do this. And that somebody's going to be doing it. And the people that are doing it are going to have an influence on our world for good or for evil, right? So what I hope is that they first of all then do it intelligently, go in there with their eyes open. And it's like in the Gospels where Jesus says, count the cost. You figure out in advance what it's going to be, and you determine honestly whether or not you're willing to contend with those realities and to pay that price. Similar with journalism, right? Journalism is a lost discipline in terms of people that, journalism is no longer a place that you think of as a place for fair-minded, non-ideological truth tellers, right? But at the same time, does that mean that we take people that would be really good at it and would be truth-telling and discourage them from the discipline? Well, they should at least know going in what it is and consider their alternatives. So, for example, something that I suggest to more and more people is I say, you realize economists study many of the things that sociologists do. They look at gun control and deterrence research and crime. They look at the effects of family breakdown. They look at no-fault divorce laws and the social impact of no-fault divorce. I mean, one legitimate question is, would you be better off going into an economics program that's like a rational choice type program, getting the chops and the skills to do this type of analysis, and then situate yourself within an economics program somewhere, let's say studying family policy and family issues?
Yeah.
Would that be a better location for you to get this accomplished than trying to say that marriage is important and the breakdown of the nuclear family is a bad thing within a typical state college sociology program? And that's an open and legitimate question. Should you maybe be in political science? Should you maybe get a formal degree in criminology as opposed to studying crime as a sociologist? It's certainly, I don't think we want people to not realize how bad things have gotten. Just like you certainly wouldn't want a young person that you cared about just signing up for the army without really understanding what they're getting into and what might be required of them.
I mean, you're just trying to be realistic. I mean, there's two dangers that you're trying to avoid. You don't want to be alarmist, right? But at the same time, you don't want to be Pollyannish and thinking that everything's fine and dandy and we're looking at life through rose-colored glasses. I mean, we're not, it's hard to say we're in a better place in society today than in the 1950s or 40s and 50s. Different challenges, of course, and we've talked about this other times, but the sort of institutions, conventions, and general sense of what holds everything together has really been lost in the culture.
Right. So we don't want to retreat, but we don't want to be unrealistic about what engagement's going to really look like.
About what the challenge is, yeah.
Yeah, and meanwhile, of course, there's so many organizations that are looking for people with good, if it's not formal sociology, good social science chops in terms of logic, theory, and the ability to do the research. And there's a shortage of folks that they could hire that would be a good mission fit for them. I mean, where is Right to Life or Child and Family Protection Institute or Heritage Foundation or let's say the Pennsylvania Family Institute?
Right.
Where are these people going to get their consultants and their researchers from if every single person who's even just fair-minded feels that there's no place for them in these social science disciplines?
So let's talk about
this. Handing the other to them by default.
Yeah.
I really want to do that.
Let's talk about this more than intersection between the social sciences. Well, maybe what we do is, so one of the, and we've kind of touched on this, but maybe let's try and make it a little more explicit. What demarcates then social sciences from just philosophy, right? More generally, but then also just from doing statistics. And again, I mean, there's different types of sociology being done. We've just talked about that. But let's get a clearer sense of, in theory, what social sciences are, what they do, and then that maybe give a better sense of how we can kind of appropriate that domain of knowledge into our Christian worldview.
Well, the Emil Durkheim, one of our founders and a brilliant guy, and it's fairly common back then, a lot of the founders of sociology, their formal schooling was often in philosophy. And there's a reason why it's called a Doctor of Philosophy degree. But anyway, he said, I spent my whole life trying to escape philosophy. And I found that I end up continually being brought back there. In other words, the more research that I do, the more I study the world, the more I realize that it brings me back to these basic philosophical questions and issues. In other words, what separates us from number crunchers, I hope, and first of all, we don't all do number crunching. A lot of us do qualitative and logical type analysis, or humanistic type sociology, where it's almost more like history. Is that we ultimately do want to not just look at the numbers and the facts, but to make sense of them and be able to hearken back to and use the toolkits that we've been given by our faith, but by kind of philosophical things. And so for example, in the book that I did after the revolution, Sex and the Single Evangelical, I look at hard data about the degree of different types of sexual activity among different kinds of Christians, in order to kind of bring us to look at the fact that the church is a mess, that we've departed very significantly in both our core beliefs and our practices from the teachings of the Bible in these areas, right? But then what happens is I want to say, well, why is that the case? Well, I could look at the hardcore factors. Well, it's a rise of single parent homes. It's, it's this hardcore factor. It's the internet revolution. It's these kinds of things. But I also can't escape that there's also fundamental changes in our assumptions, presuppositions, and worldview categories that have dramatically altered the cultural landscape and have altered the way that people look at something like a teaching of the Bible and apply and make sense of it, such that their worldview undermines the plain teaching of the scripture. Moralistic therapeutic deism, the rise of a sensate culture, and the idea that you begin and end with man as the source of truth rather than looking to tradition or religion or any kind of higher authority that binds us and that's elevated above us and makes judgments about us. The rise of the therapeutic self, the rise of expressive individualism, and in America replacing rugged individualism, toughness, with expressive individualism. I whine, I need to feel safe all the time, right? So that to really make sense of these facts, you have to draw on these larger categories, and ultimately, Scripture is, and historic Christian teaching that flows out of Scripture is ultimately the platform for me for making sense of these facts and for looking at them. And so I end up spending a lot of time, whether I'm talking to audiences about this or whether I'm, like in the book or articles, on going back and saying, look at the larger cultural and philosophical and theological trends. Don't just look at these facts. Some of these other proximate factors are important, right? Kids from divorced homes are more likely to be promiscuous than kids from intact homes. Okay, we can look at that, right? But we also have to look at, we have a fundamentally different conception of God than people had 30 years ago. God is little, people are big. God wants us to be happy.
Right.
As long as we're happy, God's happy. Nobody really goes to hell. The what is sinful is what makes other people unhappy, not what makes God unhappy. All these different things. So I think that's what separates us from number crunchers. And unfortunately, what happens, Peter Sorokin called this quantaphrenia. He called it like a form of insanity, where all you do is number crunching and you produce these journal articles that use these fancy statistics to crunch numbers and then give you these very limited findings. And suppose you add these up and it becomes knowledge. He thought that was ridiculous, right? But he did heavy duty research and analysis, and his multi-volume social and cultural dynamics, just enormous quantities of research, but all made sense of in terms of he's quoting Greek philosophers, Roman philosophers, medieval thinkers, Catholic theology, Orthodox theology. He's kind of pulling it all together. And that's what sociology at its best looks like. And that's what you find that the great thinkers like Weber were able to do. They were just voracious readers and interested in all these different aspects, and really felt that they needed to draw them all together in order to help to understand the facts that we see.
Yeah.
And so that's what separates us from just number crunchers.
It's interesting because when you mentioned what's it, Sorokin was what was his first name? Petirim. Yeah. And Zimmerman in the book that I read references him as the greatest sociologist of the family in his day.
Oh, he was, yeah.
Yeah. So the book I read by Zimmerman is Family and Civilization. And he's bringing in, the Greeks, the Roman, St. Augustine, he references constantly in this book. The canon law of the medieval church and so on and so forth.
That's what the great ones ones.
Yeah. Now part of that could be because of maybe something like the splintering of the disciplines into very specialized
and that's another
categories, which is another problem. And so you get a sociologist who's just very narrowly focused and not well read, hasn't read the canon of classical literature.
They know a lot about a little.
They
can't connect it to anything else.
Right, exactly. And especially if religious thinkers are personae non gratia, right? That, they're sort of off limits, then you're not going to get a lot of the great thinking, historical thinking on this. Well, I've noticed, or you're only going to go to Foucault, and Foucault's going to be your source for everything historical.
Sorokin wrote a book, I believe the exact title is The Sexual Revolution.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So he wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution. He viewed it as the natural outcome of a sensate culture.
Yeah.
That anything that's ultimately sense-based is going to be obsessed with sex.
Sure. Because it's the most extreme, it's the most profound sensual experience that the human person can, outside of maybe something like others have written, the experience of war itself,
Right. So so I tell people that, and they're like, oh, well, Jan, I mean, everybody knows about the sexual revolution. Yes, but did they write a book about the sexual revolution that was published in 1956?
Right. Well, and it's fascinating because this was written in 47.
Right.
And he's saying how sensate the cultures become. I mean, he has these wonderful passages where you think like, oh, this must have been written in like 2014 or something, or 2000 after Obergefell Hodge, and that, like, no, it's 1947. And he's talking about how loose the cultures become with regards to marriage, sex, children, so on and so forth, that we're basically like the ancient Greeks, but we're not as honest about it. The Greeks and the Romans were at least honest about what they were doing sexually.
Yes, right.
The other thing is, you mentioned the amount of research and quantitative data that is done though, by Sorokin and others. And reading on the Frankfurt School, I gotta tell you, to me, it always seemed like these guys were first and foremost sort of Marxist Hegelians. The theory came first, and they were not really interested, or Adorno was not really interested in the quantitative data. It was always the surveys and the research that, it's like, do we have to do this? It was really the ideology driving everything. And I think in my reading of the Frankfurt School, when the quantitative data got in the way, they were willing to just say, well, that's not really what we're doing. They really were doing more philosophy than
Yeah.
sociology. Yeah.
Yeah, and you do not look to them for hardcore, rigorous empirical analysis. You just don't see that much. I'm not saying they never do it. You don't see that much of it in their work, and then a lot of it is just frankly not understandable. I'll actually take.
It's as Brian McGee once put it, he was interviewing Marcuse back in '87, and that his modern philosophy, he called it turgid. Thought that was a good, it's that. I mean, or Adorno's impossible to understand. Almost.
You know how they like to use the word hegemony a lot, right?
Yeah.
So I gave a paper here about 15 years ago about the problems in the discipline of sociology. And one that I brought up was postmodernism, and it's no longer able to communicate. Even if they have something important to say, they can't communicate it. I called it that portion of my paper, the title was The Hegemony of Gobbledygook.
Yeah.
And then I would literally take portions of their writings and put them up on a PowerPoint and let the audience look at it, maybe 4 sentences, right? And I would say, tell me what they're saying here. And everybody just stared, and then they just started shutting down. And I said, and then I say, well, here's what they said, and I would say it in like 5 words.
Yeah, you can. You have to spend some time doing it. Now I will say, okay, so
but they're not saying it in 5 words.
No, they're not. And I think Adorno was mad. I think he was literally insane in some way. I mean, this type of sociology, if you want to call that, or social theory, to me is just like, it's the ultimate form of navel gazing. I mean, it really is dark at the end of the day. I mean, Adorno's got theories on how people cough differently based on what class they're from. I mean, he talks about the bourgeois coughing a certain way as opposed to the proletariat. And you're like, what's going on in this guy's mind? I mean, this is like incredible.
And have you actually measured that?
Nitpicking.
And determined based on controlled studies, the statistically significant differences in cough style.
No, these are all his qualitative aesthetic analyses of
that's right.
How people cough. But now I do recall Marcuse saying in that interview with McGee that they felt, in part, to break out of the normative hegemonic system that was in place, they had to invent their own language. That was part of the liberation from the oppressive power that had, reified, to use some of their terms.
Well, dealing with linguistic categories is a huge deal to those guys.
Well, I know it is, like, because I think at the end of the day, that's all there is. Right. And you see this too in the critical legal studies and critical race theorists who pick up from the Frankfurt School. So if you remember, Angela Davis was a disciple of Herbert Marcuse.
Oh yeah, big time.
And I think she was at UCLA. Maybe Angela Harris was the one at UCLA, but I know they were out here in LA because this is where Marcuse ended his career, and I think Adorno as well. I think Horkheimer moved back to Frankfurt, but and then you get the other critical race theorists, Bell and Harris and Crenshaw, and they're constantly talking about rhetorical strategies. Because there are no essences, there's no substance to speak of. You cannot evoke anything that would harken back to any kind of classical theory of human nature. like anything Aristotelian, or it's all off the table. You can't use that. So it seems to me at the end of the day, it is, you retain even ideas like the idea of like race itself, which some contemporary philosophers I've wanted to just get rid of because they don't think it refers to anything. Right. But the critical race theory will say, but you have to keep the term because it has political use.
Yeah, you can use it as a sledgehammer.
It's a rhetorical sort of it's strategy or device that you can use that has psychological effects on the public, and those psychological effects are what you need to invoke or evoke if you want to have the political change.
Yeah, and see, facts then become irrelevant and all that. So, for example, there's no objective analysis in the world that's going to tell you that the killing of unarmed black males by police is a common occurrence, or that it's approximate danger.
There was a Harvard economist who did research on this. I forget his name. Roland Fryer, I think, was his name.
Well, there are entities like the Washington Post that now actually track this, and you're like, okay, we're going to take one of the most liberal newspapers in the country that they're going to keep putting out the actual numbers. Look at the freaking numbers.
Yeah.
And say, okay, out of the number of potentially deadly interactions, is a police officer more likely to kill an unarmed person if they're African American than if they're white? Well, the answer appears to be no, right? And by the way, in how many cases is that unarmed really not all that unarmed? So, for example, well, he was pointing a gun at the cop, but it turned out later that it was not loaded or that it was a fake gun. Well, how does a police officer supposed to know that, right? But you're still going to classify that as an unarmed killing. Now, it's not that I want to get into that issue per se. When you bring that kind of stuff up around critical race theory, Frankfurtian type people, they not only consider that irrelevant, they consider it oppressive to even have that conversation. You're like, wait a second. If you're concerned about young black lives, then what you really should be concerned about is black on black killing, particularly in large urban areas run by red state or red politics type governments, Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C.
Blue state politics, not red.
Right? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Blue state. You're right. Blue state.
So I don't want to confuse those things. Blue state.
Well, so the fact is that, but you're going to focus on the one basically because you can use it as a political sledgehammer, and then you're going to spin all this rhetoric. And then here's the big move too. If I insist on talking about the true causes of black deaths as a result of firearms, for example, I now literally become an oppressor for talking about it, and my classroom becomes unsafe.
Yeah.
Because certain privileged, oppressed people might have their ideas challenged there and be made to feel, quote, unsafe. So we're not opposed to freedom of speech, but we want people to feel safe. And the only way they can feel safe is for you to curtail your freedom of speech. And suddenly you find you're talking in circles. And if you point out that this is a logical scrambled eggs, then the logic itself becomes a tool of the oppressor. The language becomes a tool of the oppressor. Everything ultimately becomes this thing. And
this is in critical theory terms, it'd be white reasoning. In queer theory terms, it'd be heteronormative reasoning.
Right. As opposed to, here's a set of facts.
Yeah.
Deal with it. And so the funny thing is, critical race theory as a legal theory, which is where it started, and critical theory generally was a complete failure. People who spent much time on it in law school couldn't pass bar exams, couldn't represent clients, and everybody stayed away from it like the plague because it just became known as a bunch of mindless yip-yaw, right? That definitely did not turn you into a very good attorney. So you couldn't even help oppressed people because you couldn't practice law very well, right? All you could do is criticize the law.
Yeah.
But
Well, and that is
now is it's making a comeback, and we're finding it in the judiciary circles
yeah.
increasingly. We put more and more people. Now we have critical legal theory judges
Right.
evaluating the Constitution critically.
Right. Because the ideology has to, there's a great little book that Alistair McIntyre wrote. I always reference it. I want people to read, called Marxism and Christianity, where he makes this very powerful, and he wrote it while he was still a sort of Marxist, socialist at least, and with just a very powerful insight into the fuller program of Marxism as truly the replacement for Christianity in for modern man, right? And all of these
Heresy, actually.
So yeah, it's sort of, it's the immanentization of eschatology, of the communion of the saints, because we're going to have the utopian society and everything else, with obviously man as God, right? We have to engineer this. So in any of these versions of that, whether it's critical race theory and stuff, there's just this. I think this is why guys like John McWhorter call it religious thinking. Although I don't like, I mean, he wants to throw Christianity in with that type of thinking, this sort of just
he's an atheist.
Ideological utopianism, right? Where we don't take reality at face value. We don't take into account the facts of the matter that don't quite fit into our worldview, which I think, as Christians, we do have to avoid that. We got to be careful. We look at reality square, the problem of evil and suffering square in the face, right? And not and come up with good arguments. But this is sort of like that extreme type of religious thinking, where it's sort of the ideology will always and always has to suppress, overlook, or just trump the facts of the matter. And that's why you can't have the open and respectful dialogue on campuses, right? Because those are inconvenient, attacks on the ideology. Not even just inconvenient truths, to reference Al Gore. Inconvenient truths. But David, let's wrap it up this way. You kind of touched on this earlier. You're at a church, you're at a local church, you got a group of young adults, high schoolers in front of you. Do you encourage them to go into this field, and why?
If they have the right talent and inclinations and motives, yes, with the caveat that they're getting good guidance and interaction at every step of the way, including intelligent people in the Christian community that are able to really engage them and help them think through a lot of the things that it's going to be thrown at them. And they're willing to do a lot of hard work on the side in terms of reading and thinking and wrestling. And they're willing to take the occasional hit from people who just go after them because of what they believe. And the emphasis is that whether you're doing research for organizations, independent research, or working in an academic setting, or working, for example, in government agencies, the need for people to do fair-minded, thoughtful, not just number crunching, but true social science, interpreting, thinking through, wrestling with facts, and applying them to try to help people sort through things and make better decisions. The need for that is acute and great. There's a shortage of people that can do it. And we definitely need people to counterbalance the increasing kind of left-wing, ideologically activist takeover of these disciplines. So yes, do it, but approach it intelligently, know what you're getting into, and make sure that you realize you're not going to be able to handle this by yourself. You're going to need mentors, you're going to need guides, and you need to make careful choices about where you study this as well, because you don't want to put yourself in a no-win situation. In that sense, I would say yes. I wrote a chapter on the field of sociology for the omnibus reader, which is used in classical Christian schools, Veritas Press.
Yeah, great.
I
Okay.
have students that come here and they say, "Oh, I read your essay when I was in high school. I was in a classical school, or I was in a homeschool." And I try to lay out the strengths and the weaknesses of the field and its potential objectively, and just encourage students that if they go into it, here's what to avoid, here's what to embrace, and here's what you need to know. Even if you're just going to take classes at the college level, this is what you may encounter.
Does bad sociology corrupt good theology?
Yes.
How so?
Well,
Can you give some examples of in your own experience? Or the church, if you want to replace theology with just the church.
well, you do lousy sociology, for example, in the area of marriage and family, in order to basically say that something isn't really all that harmful, that clearly is. So then what happens when you confront the scriptures telling you that it's harmful as well and telling you to avoid it? Well, if you've decided that sociology is more important, really important to you, then you're going to want to reinterpret scripture to match your sociological understanding. But your sociological understanding is flawed if it, for example, denies the importance of let's say marriage. Or here's one. I've watched social scientists explain away what the scriptures teach about the need of children for discipline. And so ultimately they try to reinterpret scripture to accommodate permissive child rearing, because the junk social science they're doing, basically, they think they're going to turn their kids into an abuser if they discipline them. That's really flawed research. I think that would be a good example of that.
So it kind of mirrors maybe the conversation that we were having 67 years ago, where, if you have the natural sciences, which, the hard sciences, which you think that's your true source of authority, right? Your Baconian sciences. Then when you go to the scriptures, oh, well, right, the scriptures get downgraded as a source of knowledge vis-a-vis the natural sciences. The same thing's happening here at the social level as well, right? If you got that, like social theories, right? Maybe they have a few numbers behind them, but they're not quite, enough. But if that's what you're taking as a sort of a higher level of authority, source of knowledge, then you got to go to the scriptures and you're going to interpret the scriptures or reinterpret them or just throw them out at the end of the day, right?
Yes, and the fact is, truth matters. And so if you're doing and embracing bad sociology, then ultimately you're embracing things that aren't true.
Yeah.
And then if you're going to try to reconcile your Christian faith to those things, you're trying to reconcile the Christian faith to things that aren't true. So of course it's going to corrupt it. It has to. And so
it's interesting. I was reading Paul Tillich this morning, who certainly was no conservative theologian, but he made some excellent points in the prolegomena of his systematic theology about the why we are afraid of falling into error, cognitive error, because he talked about true knowledge is the union of the subject with the object of knowledge. There's a yoking together when we grasp something. So, and I think it was good. It was interesting the way he put it, because it reminded me that when we make an error, or when we believe in error, it's not just a purely intellectual thing that's going on there. There's sort of a yoking of our entire selves to that error. It starts to shape our being, right? We come into union. And this is far richer, more biblical and theological. Jesus called Satan, the one thing he called him was the father of lies. And it's not just that we believe a lie and it kind of stays up there in a very abstract kind of way in our intellect. We actually yoke ourselves to this error. We come into union with it, and we start to participate in the error, right? And paraphrase Lewis was that we need good philosophy if for any other reason that bad philosophy has to be fought against, right? And I used to say the same thing with sociology.
Well, the Hebrew conception of knowledge, or the word to know,
Yes.
involved an active connection and intimate engagement with the thing being known and a moral responsibility for it. It's not an accident that sex would be referred to as knowing. And we tend to think of that we can detach ourselves from truth, right? From the things that we know, and like you said, it's all kind of in our brain. But in fact, a true understanding of knowledge is that we are intimately connected with what we are attempting to know, and we have a moral responsibility for it. And so if we're embracing falsehood, it's going to corrupt us, it's going to corrupt our faith, it's going to corrupt the people around us, and it's going to destroy the very thing that we are attempting to understand.
Yeah.
We should look at, and this is, I think, true in every discipline, knowing is a sacred act.
Yeah.
It's a sacred task. And it's one in which it should really involve us in our whole being, and ideally, and this idea of detached knowledge, I think, is it's one alien to the Jewish tradition. It's alien to the Christian tradition, and it's alien, I think, to what human good really is. And so we have a responsibility to get it right and to fix it when we get it wrong, which we will inevitably do. I was wrong about that. I actually have built into my lectures in different classes where I've tried to deliberately put places in the classes where I used to think, but now I know I was wrong. I used to teach this in class until I discovered that what I was teaching was wrong. And then I worked through the process why I believed this was right when it wasn't, and how I discovered it was wrong. Partly because I want students to understand that that's part of the process. Yeah. Because we do take this seriously. And when we screw it up, just like in every other area of our life, we have to go through a kind of repentance. You know, I was wrong about this. I'm going to admit it. I'm going to fix it.
That's the right kind of dialectic.
Yes.
Yeah, that's all back to good old Socrates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was wrong, and finding out that I was wrong and why I screwed up became one of the most valuable things in my life. And I'm okay telling students that your professor has done this. You know.
Well, you know, that's
understanding. You know,
that powerful. I mean, that's that idea of recognizing the error of one's ways and repenting is a very powerful message these days for all the left, you know, for all those who want to shut down any opposing data or voice in our society, because they're so convinced that they're right. Right.
Well, so one of the greatest sociologists who ever lived is Peter Berger.
Yes, very famous.
Peter Berger, I had the opportunity to have kind of an intimate dinner with him and just a few other people, including my wife, about a year or two before he died.
Was he a believer of some sort?
He called himself a liberal Lutheran theologically, but definitely a man. His faith was important to him, and he also liked his religion to be fairly conservative in its substance. So he's a complicated guy that way. Yeah. But he, his book Sacred Canopy, you know, was famous for advancing secularization theory. But then his subsequent research, he decided that at least how he had framed it, it was bunk. Religion isn't going anywhere. It's in fact, serious religion is flourishing everywhere and becoming a major force to be reckoned with. We're only 2 days away from 9/11. If we don't think religion is important, we examine. It was religion that led those people to fly those airplanes into those buildings.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so first of all, he said I was wrong. He retracted it. So in my theory class, I show an interview with Peter Berger from just a couple of years before he died. And in the interview, he's asked about the book Sacred Canopy. And would you do it again? And he said, I can't remember his exact words. He said, the whole book was wrong. No, I wouldn't do it again.
Yeah.
I couldn't recommend it, except I think he said, don't quote me. He said, I think the first chapter where he kind of laid out some categories and frameworks. He said, so there's this little part of the book that I think holds up pretty well. The rest of it is pure crap. Don't pay any attention to it. He's talking about his best, probably maybe his best known work,
Right.
And I show that to students, and then I say, this is what we are supposed to be like. We're supposed to be guys like this.
Yeah. Well, and to AJ Ayers' credit, he said the same thing about I forget the title of his little treatise on positivism, what it was, but when he was asked by Brian McGee about what the major problem with positivism was, he just said, well, it was all false. It was all wrong. We were excited about it, but it turned out to be totally wrong. So
we have falsified positives, which is very ironic.
Yeah, right. Well, and it's interesting because I think, there is and we'll have to do another, we could talk for a long time. Because there is what I don't want to suggest, we don't think what we're suggesting is that people cannot have their bedrock convictions and stick to their guns to the day they breathe their last. Sure. That's not what we're saying. And that's going to include certain social and moral issues where at some point you plant your flag and you say, here I stand, I can do no other. Because I do want to avoid this idea of, and what I would call it's been referenced with endless dialogue. I always think of the Episcopalian ghost in chapter 5 of Great Divorce, who always wants to just let the free winds of inquiry blow through his mind. He never just wants to actually be with God. He just wants to think about God concepts for eternity, and hence he's relegated to, what is either hell or purgatory, the gray town. And that's not what we're saying, but we are saying we need to be in a place where we can recognize error when we see it and repent and change our tune, which sounds like a very Christian idea, actually, at the end of the day.
Yeah, it definitely does. We could ask Peter about that.
David, this has been great. I really appreciate it. We're definitely going to have to do it again and get into some other details on other issues. And so we'll sign off for now and see you again next time. God bless.